A little monster. Seeing is believing, right? Or some things seem to the naked eye just too fantastic and therefore beyond belief. Chris Walker believes that he and a group of his friends witnessed such a sight just before midnight on July 4th, 1990, when he was 14 years old. Chris, now 46, is a no-nonsense type of fellow. A family man with a wife and 2 children, he's worked in the construction industry for over 3 decades. He's not the type to lie or just make up stories. Chris later told a local researcher that he and his buddies had been sitting on a stack of old wooden skids behind a factory building located on the east side of Henderson, Kentucky that night. One of the boys had pilfered a pack of Camel filterless smokes from his old man and passed it around. The mischievous quintet was sitting there watching the fireworks and smoking cigarettes. All of them knew they were too young to be doing it. One of them was only 10 years old, but doing what wasn't allowed was a way to be cool. Still, the 10-year-old was in Chris' care, and if they'd gotten caught that night, he said it would have been his ass. All around them were dumpsters and many stacks of old skids from the factory. Chris was busily engaged in the seemingly endless endeavor of being cooler than his other teenage buddies, tougher and braver, when all their boasts were cut short by a loud banging sound coming from somewhere close behind them. They turned to look and saw, about 30 feet away, a wooden crate sitting atop a rusted old BFI dumpster. Good old Browning Ferris Industries. The crate was moving each time the noise rang out, and the youths realized, with much astonishment, that whatever was making the noise was inside the crate, trying to beat its way out. The crate started to rock back and forth until it finally toppled from the edge of the dumpster and fell to the ground with a crash. What happened next, he said, was the most frightening moment in his young life. Slowly rising from the wooden debris was a dwarf-like creature, covered from head to toe, except for its face and hands, in short, dark hair of uniform length. The street lamp just down at the corner illuminated the thing clearly and reflected red in the creature's eyes. Fully erect, it stood only around 3.5 feet tall. It started to look around, frantically turning this way and that, as if disoriented or lost. The boys stared wide-eyed at the thing, glued to the spot by the numbing fear which froze them all. It had pointed ears, like a pig's, he said, and red eyes with a flat, wide nose. Chris further described the creature as having a mangy appearance. Some of the hair on its body was thin or bald, and the skin beneath was dark brown, while on its bare face and hands the skin seemed a lighter shade. The group watched as the thing continued to look around bewilderedly for about 10 seconds. Then, when the reality of what they were seeing finally sank in, their paralysis broke, and they all fled the scene with much haste, running all the way back to Chris' house, nearly half a mile away, without stopping. Of course, no one believed them when they told their stories. When Chris spoke about the encounter in 2006, he was able to give even more details about the entity's appearance. He said it was muscular, and it had the overall bodily proportions of a midget. Although the arms were of normal length, it had short bowed legs. They couldn't see its feet. Moreover, it seemed like it had been wearing clothing of some sort, which was threadbare and torn, hanging off its arms and legs in short, ragged strips. When the group fled, they dared not look back, he said, for fear that it might be giving chase. The next year, 1991, Chris was surprised by an impromptu visit from another friend who was not involved in or even knew of the aforementioned experience. Something seemed wrong with him to the point that Chris had blatantly asked him what was the matter. The youth was not willing to tell, at first, for fear of ridicule, but at length he acquiesced and said that, as he was driving over the Washington Street Bridge, which spanned Canoe Creek near Lincoln Avenue, he heard what sounded like a woman screaming in pain. Then, suddenly, a small, dark, hair-covered little thing ran out from under the bridge on 2 legs and up into the mouth of a large drainage tunnel. It stopped then and turned toward the passing vehicle, letting out another high-pitched scream. It had red eyes and pointed ears. I still have absolutely no idea what that thing was, he said in 2019, but that was the scariest moment of my life. The Sturgis Vampire. What was it that one frightened witness saw while driving alone along the back roads of western Kentucky on a snowy Christmas Eve back in 1983? It was certainly no animal, that she'd ever seen or heard of. The blood-flecked albino creature looked like something out of a nightmare, and ran and stood on two legs like a man, glaring at her with its fiery red eyes, breathing heavily, fangs exposed. The vision of the bloody, inhumanoid creature standing there in her headlights has haunted her for over 40 years, yet it still seems like only yesterday to her. She says, "It was while traveling these back roads between Sturgis and Morganfield in Union County, Kentucky," she told me, "that a decidedly remarkable creature crossed my path. The incident left me in such utter terror that, from then on, I refused to drive alone at night along any deserted or isolated country roads again. This wasn't an apparition, a ghostly image, strange voices, or unexplained poltergeist activity. There were no warning premonitions of something watching from the shadows, no omens, no mystic dreams, and no psychic sensations. But all that happened that evening, short as the encounter had been, will become intense memories of profound fear. One that still surfaces sometimes, like right now, sending chills all over my flesh at the time of this recording. It was snowing that evening along Highway 60 on my journey from Evansville, Indiana, where I worked at the time, back to Kentucky to see my family for the holidays. Although it was late, close to midnight on Christmas Eve 1983, the roads were well traveled. Not bumper-to-bumper congestion, of course, but enough of a line that it got on my nerves. The cars ahead of me evidently were not sure of the surface of the road as it snowed, and they were keeping to an extremely safe speed, almost 30 miles per hour below the limit. I could not see the beginning of the line as it stretched along into the darkness ahead, nor see the end that drew out behind me. It was just a steady flow of cars going about 25 miles per hour. On a normal evening with dry weather conditions, all these cars would have been stretched far enough apart along the two-lane highway that no one would have known how many there actually were. But that night, we were all clustered together, going along at the unseen leader's pace. I was confident that I could travel safely at a higher rate of speed, so I decided to take an old country back road that would cut around the parade of cars and hopefully leave me ahead of the traffic where it joined Highway 60 again, about 15 miles down. The old back road I chose ran past some of the abandoned Peabody coal mines, which made for an eerie picture against the peaceful snowfall. The snow itself had been powdery enough that it scattered in whirlwinds as I drove through it, revealing a relatively and surprisingly dry pavement beneath. The heavier snowfall must have stayed north of this road, because Highway 60 had been much more slippery and slushy in spots. This allowed me to do at least 35 to 40 miles per hour. The digital readout on the dash read 12:17 a.m., and I thought to myself, "Merry Christmas." At precisely that time, I caught a movement in my peripheral vision coming from a field on the left side of the road. My first impulse was that it was a deer running over the expanse of the field and leaping upwards and over clumps of brush. Being familiar with the road, I knew that up ahead was a very sharp curve to the right. Letting up on the accelerator and lightly touching the brakes, I slowed my vehicle down to about 20 miles per hour to anticipate the deer crossing my path as it was traveling closer to my side of the road. It remained a murky object until it reached the widespread beam from my headlights, and I saw that this was definitely not a deer, nor was it a four-legged animal of any type, for that matter. It ran on two legs, two human-like legs. As it deliberately moved towards the road from the field just inside the curve, I feared a collision would ensue. I hit the brakes, fought a few skids, then came to a stop a few yards in front of what had jumped onto the pavement and was standing at a halt in the beam of my headlights. It appeared to be a naked man, relatively tall, about 6.5 feet in height, with milky white flesh that blended in with the snow. He was raised up on the balls of his large feet, with his legs slightly spread apart as if preparing to pounce, and his particular hairy back was hunched over slightly with his arms elevated halfway up from his sides for balance. Its muscles were tight, solid outlines resembling the finely chiseled marble on a statue from a museum. One of the upper leg muscles trembled like a horse after a hard race. Its sexual anatomy was matted with tangles, uncircumcised and strangely hefty for a human. There were long, thick, disheveled patches of dark brown hair protruding from its body in various odd places, mostly on its upper torso. Its head was covered with the same untamed mess that hung like a lion's mane over its shoulders and down its back. It just stood there, staring at me through the windshield. Its eyes were like red fiber optic lights with no white around the pupils. Its eyes were like red fiber optic lights with no white around the pupils, and they seemed to have the same iridescent glow that an animal has when caught in the beam of headlights. There were large clouds of warm air coming fast from its mouth as it momentarily rested from running through the field. Its nostrils were large and flared and seemed out of contour for a human. Between the thick exhales of breath, I could see some color around its mouth, chin, and neck that went down to its chest. It too was red, but this glistened in the light's gleam as something wet would. The large snowflakes fell around its hair, melting when it touched the red liquid that stained its skin. He appeared to have bled liberally, recently, from a wound somewhere in the facial area. My mind was racing with questions and possibilities as to what or whom it was that stood there. Was I the victim of a practical joker? Was it a man who had been in an accident or had been attacked and needed help? An escaped convict? Nothing made sense, really, as I took in more of his ragged features. His ribs were revealed with each heave of his breath, as if he was malnourished. Patches of hair hung in clumps on the torso. A few scattered leaves clung to his unruly mane. His arms were as muscular as his thighs and were abnormally long and slender, and his hands ended in spindly fingers with long, ragged nails. They, too, were covered with what appeared to be blood and dirt. In frightful silence, I studied the figure and saw that the blood and dirt was spread sporadically over its abdomen and on its chest. My eyes went back up to the face. Its breath had slowed, and more of its features were revealed. Its mouth showed boxy, outsized teeth and what appeared to be a hideous grin, mixed with saliva and blood and stained pink. Its lips opened wider in warning and revealed two large canines that were thick and longer than the other teeth. Then it licked its bottom teeth with its tongue, running it across his bottom lip. It still maintained an unblinking stare, with eyes that seemed to pulse inside its sunken cheekbones, as if pondering what action to take next. It was in that one tense moment of direct connection when I truly realized the strong difference between beast and man. I was the unwary traveler who had interrupted his beastly movements, and we were now at a standstill, awaiting its decision of whether to pass over my intrusion and go onward or engage in an attack. It closed its mouth, snorted a hefty gust of air, then just as quickly as it had jumped onto the road a few moments before, jumped away to the other side with an uncanny grace, barely touching the ditch and running through the opposite field. I sat there in my car for a few minutes more, looking back and forth at the tracks it had left in the snow, and from both sides of the road. The rest of my travels that evening were rushed and a bit too fast for the road conditions, I will admit. When it was time to leave the next day to return to Evansville, I opted to drive during the daylight hours and to stay on the main roads. Back at work that next week, several of my co-workers in the break room were discussing a series of cattle mutilations and farm animal killings going on in various surrounding counties. Some of the cattle were reportedly left alive, others ripped apart, and some just had certain organs removed. These incidents ranged from the farmlands of southern Indiana and down through western Kentucky. There were several guesses as to what was attacking the animals, and they ranged from coyotes, wolves, and one even suggested that aliens did it. I never spoke up as to what I'd seen, and silently kept the knowledge of that strange nighttime visitor to myself for fear of ridicule. Inside, I knew that the extraordinary creature I'd observed that holiday eve could possibly be the culprit to all the carnage the farmers were experiencing. Years later, after I moved back down to Kentucky, I came upon some other witnesses that had seen the same type of creature around the Sturgis area in the same county. It prompted me to do some research, and I did indeed find that this scruffy biped had been given a nickname by the locals. They called it the Vampire of Sturgis. Over the years, I listened to stories of even more animals being killed, which included domesticated pets as well, supposedly snatched away from their own yards. Relatives or friends of the witnesses that lived in distant counties reported that it had been spotted as far away as Madisonville and then in the Marion and Salem areas of western Kentucky. All the descriptions of the creature ran about the same: lean-looking, naked, but with patches of long scraggly hair, humanoid, but animalistic in features, biped. Whatever this entity was, it seems to have faded back into the twilight world from which it came, and there have been no further reported sightings of this humanoid since 1983. Mothman. Terror from Above. By far the most famous and well-investigated case of an alleged flying inhumanoid appeared in West Virginia in 1966 and 67. The creature, which was seen or encountered by multiple independent witnesses, was dubbed Mothman. And even after the passage of some 50-odd years, the case remains one of the most fascinating and enduring cryptozoological/paranormal events of the 20th century. The name alone, Mothman, still makes some people shiver even today. Many people, in retrospect, consider the terrifying entity to have been a harbinger of doom, for its appearance presaged a terrible disaster which struck in the dead of night just before Christmas, causing the deaths of 46 people. Most researchers cite November 12, 1966, as the date on which the Mothman phenomenon first appeared in West Virginia, but, in truth, a large winged humanoid creature was seen in Looneyville, West Virginia, several decades before the events of the mid-60s. Also, in 1964, 2 years before the series of Mothman sightings which would eventually become famous took place, a woman and her father were driving down Route 2 along the Ohio River on their way to the Chief Cornstalk hunting grounds one night when a dark, man-like figure stepped out onto the road in front of their car. The woman, who was driving at the time, decelerated as she approached the form, which now stood in the middle of the road, and she was horrified by what she saw when it came fully into view in the car's headlights. It was larger than a man, the witness claimed, 6 to 7 feet tall, and its skin was a dull pewter gray color. Its most shocking feature, however, was that it had no head, only an empty space between the thing's shoulders, and 2 evil-looking, brightly glowing red eyes set into the creature's chest area. Suddenly, a pair of gigantic bat-like wings unfurled from the thing's back. They were so wide that they almost completely covered the entire span of the road, nearly 20 feet. The two watched in shock as the horrible avian anomaly then soared straight up into the air without flapping its wings and disappeared into the night. "We were both terrified," the witness said. "I stepped on the gas and raced out of there. We talked it over and decided not to tell anybody about it. Who would believe us?" The bizarre series of events which sparked the Mothman craze officially began on November 12, 1966, near Clendon in West Virginia, when 5 cemetery workers digging a grave in a local cemetery saw what they described as a brown human being with wings spring from its perch in some nearby trees and swoop down over their heads. They could hardly believe their eyes. It was gliding through the trees, one of the men said. 3 days later, around midnight on the evening of November 15th, 2 young couples made a wrong turn onto a country road in Point Pleasant while driving to a friend's house. As they traveled past what was called the TNT area, where a complex of old abandoned bunkers once used to store war materials was located, one of the women, Lisa Scarberry, saw 2 shining red circles about 2 inches in diameter which seemed to hang in the air. Her mouth dropped open as the glowing eyes started moving toward the car. It was about 7 feet tall, she said. It had wings that were visible on its back. The tips of the wings could be seen above its shoulders. The body of it was like a slender, muscular man and was flesh-colored. Its wings were ashen white in color. The wings looked like angel wings. Its face couldn't be seen because the eyes simply hypnotized you when you looked into them. If you looked close to its face, your eyes were just drawn to its eyes. When we first saw it, we had just topped a hill in the TNT area. and when the lights of our car hit it, it looked directly at us, as if it was scared. It had one of its wings caught in a guide wire near a section of road close to the power plant, and was pulling its wing with both hands, trying to free itself from the wire. I felt sorry for it. The other three members of the group, however, did not share her pity for the creature, feeling instead the sharp bite of fear. One of them yelled, "Let's get out of here!" and the group sped away in a panic. But only a couple moments later, as the frightened riders topped a hill, they saw the same creature, or one just like it, a second time, standing near the road. As they passed, the thing spread its wings, rocketed up into the air, and began chasing the car at speeds of upwards of 100 miles an hour. The monster was making high-pitched squeaking sounds as it flew above the car, like a record played at high speed or the squeaking of a mouse, they said. Thankfully, after a few minutes, the entity broke off the chase, allowing the witnesses to drive straight to the Point Pleasant Police Department, where they told their incredible story. Deputy Sheriff Millard Halstead believed them. He had known them all their lives, and they were not the sort to get into trouble of any kind. And one look at their faces told him they were being perfectly sincere. Halstead himself drove out to the TNT area, and later claimed that his police band radio malfunctioned while there, victim of some kind of peculiar interference. According to Halstead, the only sound his radio would make was a noise that sounded like a record playing at high speed. After a press conference was held the next day, the story hit the papers, and the enigmatic entity was quickly dubbed Mothman, after a villain in the popular Batman television show. Roger Scarberry, Lisa's husband, later told Fortean investigator John Keel, author of the groundbreaking Mothman Prophecies, that bird kept right up with us. It wasn't even flapping its wings. They also noted that, while en route to the authorities, they'd passed a large dead dog lying beside the road, but, strangely, the carcass was no longer there on their return trip. They'd all wondered where the unfortunate animal had come from, and whether the creature was somehow involved. What they didn't know, however, was that just an hour or so before, on the same evening that their own experiences took place, a building contractor 90 miles to the northeast in Salem was about to have his own mysterious encounter. At 10:30 p.m. on that November 15th, Mr. Newell Partridge was relaxing in his living room watching the television, when suddenly the screen went blank. A fine herringbone pattern appeared on the tube, he later said, and at the same time the set started a loud whining noise, winding up to a high pitch, peaking and breaking off, as if you're on a musical scale and you went as high as you could and came back down and repeated it. It sounded like a generator winding up. Outside on the front porch, Newell's dog, Bandit, began to bark furiously. Mr. Partridge got up and turned off the TV, thinking that was what was bothering the dog. But the barking continued unabated, so he grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. Bandit was facing an old barn about 450 yards away and absolutely raising hell. I shined the light in that direction, Partridge later told investigator Gray Barker, and it picked up 2 red circles, or eyes, which looked like bicycle reflectors, but much larger. Something about those glowing orbs deeply frightened him, he admitted. He was certain they were no ordinary animal's eyes. Then, with a snarl, Bandit lit out toward the barn, ignoring his master's commands to stop. Fighting the wave of intense fear that had swept over him, Partridge went back inside and grabbed his shotgun, but something stopped him from going back outside. The fear was just too strong, and he slept that night with the weapon beside him. Bandit was never seen again, unless, of course, it was his carcass that was lying on the roadside as the Scarberrys sped past. The next morning, Partridge went out to the barn to look for his dog, but found only footprints going in a circle. He said, as if that dog had been chasing his tail, though he never did that. There were no other tracks of any kind. Later that evening, the 16th, 3 adults were returning to their cars after visiting with friends in the TNT area when, suddenly, a big gray figure rose from behind the car, as if it had been lying down on the ground. One witness, a young mother named Marcella Bennett, was so frightened by the sight of the beast that she dropped her baby. It rose up slowly from the ground, she later said, a big gray thing, bigger than a man, with terrible glowing red eyes. It had no discernible head and two glowing red circles near the top of its chest. The child's father, Raymond Wamsley, quickly grabbed the baby as huge wings unfolded from the creature's back. Marcella stood there, horrified yet transfixed. It was as if the thing had her in some kind of trance, her husband later said. She couldn't move. Panic had set in, and the three managed to hasten back inside their friend's house and lock the door. Outside, they could hear the creature as it followed them, shuffling across the porch and even looking in one of the windows. The creature disappeared shortly before state police arrived. The incident reportedly traumatized Bennett for weeks afterward, and she eventually received medical treatment for her anxiety. She suffered frequent nightmares for months and came to believe that the creature paid several visits to her home. "I know it's been here," she said. "I can feel it when it's around. And I've heard it. It makes a terrible sound that goes right through your bones. It sounds like a woman screaming." In fact, all the witnesses to the Mothman entity, save for one, reported this same feeling of intense, almost unnatural fear. At around 10 p.m. on the 21st, authorities in the city of Charleston received a call from one Richard West, claiming that he had the creature in sight. In fact, it was sitting on a roof next to his home. "It looks like a man," West claimed. "It's about 6 feet tall and has a wingspread of 6 or 8 feet. It has great big red eyes." When asked if the being flew, West said straight up, just like a helicopter. 4 people saw the frightening entity on November 24th as it soared through the skies of the now famous TNT area. Motorist Thomas Urey saw the thing standing in a field on the morning of the 25th. It then spread its wings and, just as in the Scarberry incident, took off straight up like a helicopter and flew alongside the car, giving chase. "Without flapping its wings," he said. As Urey sped down Route 62, heading straight for the police station, he says, "It veered over my convertible and began going in circles 3 telephone poles high. It kept flying right over my car, even though I was doing about 75. I never saw anything like it. I was so scared that I just couldn't go to work that day. The thing had a wingspan every bit of 10 feet. It could be a bird, but I certainly never saw one like that. I was afraid it was going to come right down on top of me." A St. Albans woman claimed to have seen it standing in her front yard the next day, the 25th, but it was gone by the time help could arrive. "It was standing on the lawn next to the porch," she later told reporters. "It was tall, with big red eyes that popped out of its face. My husband is 6'1", and the bird looked like about the same height, or a little shorter, maybe. It had a funny little face. I didn't see any beak. All I saw were those big, red, poppy eyes. I screamed and ran back into the house. My brother-in-law went out to look, but it was gone." On the 27th, another female witness from Mason claimed that she was pursued by the creature, and later that night, it was allegedly seen by 2 children in St. Albans. Connie Carpenter, 18, from New Haven, West Virginia, had her encounter at 10:30 a.m. on Sunday the 27th. She was driving home from church when she saw what she first took to be a large man dressed in gray standing on the Mason County golf course. Then a pair of large wings unfolded from the entity's back. It took off straight up and headed for her car. "Those eyes, they were very red, and once they were fixed on me, I couldn't take my eyes off them," she stated. "It's a wonder I didn't have a wreck." The creature flew directly at her windshield, she said, and got quite close before it veered off and disappeared into the darkness. Carpenter was one of the very few who got a good look at the creature's face. "It was horrible," she said of it, "like something out of a science fiction movie." The witness was so upset by the encounter that she missed several days of school and sought treatment by a physician. She reportedly suffered eye burn for 2 weeks after the sighting. A few weeks later, Carpenter was walking down the street when she was approached by a big black sedan. A suntanned man then got out and attempted to kidnap her, possibly an MIB. She struggled free and fled back to the safety of her house. A short time later, she moved in with relatives, whose house soon became plagued with poltergeists. On January 11, 1967, Mrs. Mabel McDaniel, the mother of Linda Scarberry, one of the original Mothman witnesses, witnessed a large bird in flight while driving down Route 62 near Tiny's restaurant on the outskirts of Point Pleasant. I thought it was an airplane, she said. Then I realized it was flying much too low. It was brown and had a wingspan of at least 10 feet. I thought I could see 2 legs, like a man's legs, hanging down from it. It circled over Tiny's and then flew off. She didn't see any head or neck on the thing. There was no sound, and the creature did not move its wings. An Ohio man would later claim that the creature pursued his vehicle down Route 33 in March of 1967, and 2 women swore they had seen Mothman fly up to meet a waiting UFO on May 19th of that same year. According to one witness, Mrs. Brenda Stone, we were driving past the TNT area on Route 62 around 10:30 p.m. when we saw 2 bright red lights on a shadowy form high in a tree just off the road. Suddenly, this big red light appeared and approached the tree, and the figure rose toward it and disappeared. Then the big light took off to the north. On November 2nd, 1967, Mrs. Ralph Thomas heard a strange sound like a squeaky fan belt, she said, outside her home in the TNT area. When she stepped out onto her porch to investigate, she saw what she described as a tall gray figure, bigger than a man, moving swiftly among the abandoned munitions bunkers. It didn't appear to be walking, she stated, but rather sliding or gliding along the ground. She was certain that the figure she observed was neither a bear nor a man. John Keel claims that over 100 people saw Mothman over the course of the next year. Moreover, all manner of strange reports began to trickle in from the Point Pleasant area concerning a variety of strange phenomena, and it is a curious note that the Mothman events occurred during a period of heightened UFO activity, what's sometimes referred to as a flap, including the mysterious appearances of the unsettling Men in Black, or MIB. According to Keel, over 1,000 credible UFO sightings occurred in the area by the end of 1967. Numerous animal and even human deaths were attributed to this avian horror. Even Bigfoot and poltergeist reports were surfacing. A veritable whirlwind of Forteana. Hordes of journalists, monster hunters, and the just plain curious descended upon the area, adding fuel to the weird chaos that had engulfed this once peaceful community and electrified the entire nation. Everyone could feel the tension. Everyone knew that something bad was happening. Events were escalating out of control. The creature was encountered several more times that year, and then, on December 15, 1967, about a month after the last sighting took place, the Silver Bridge, a 700-foot-long suspension bridge connecting the cities of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and Canoga, Ohio, collapsed into the muddy Ohio River. Because the event happened at the worst possible time, during rush hour traffic, 76 people fell that day. 46 of them were taken down to their deaths beneath the icy water. 2 of the unfortunate victims were never found. So what was the Mothman then? So-called experts have suggested everything from sandhill cranes to oversized owls, both of which, by the way, must flap their wings to fly. But it seems obvious that the creature dubbed Mothman should have been named Mothmen, as 2 types of beings were described. One with bat-like wings, no head, and wider than a man with glowing eyes in his chest. And the other a more humanoid entity with feathered, angelic-looking wings and glowing eyes on a human-shaped head. Both types were described as having glowing red eyes and the ability to ascend straight up like a helicopter. 2 witnesses even claimed that they heard a strange mechanical humming sound as the thing flew above them. To complicate matters even further, there seems to be yet a 3rd type of Mothman frequenting the area. According to author Mark A. Hall, in the early 1900s at Point Pleasant, a large bird with the head of a man and a wingspan of at least 12 feet was seen. It happened just prior to or immediately after the occurrence of a tragic accident. It was also seen by rural farm families in Mason, Jackson, Roane, Clay, and Kanawha counties. By World War I, Birdman was observed flying over Looneyville, up Johnson Creek, down Gabe in Roane County, then down Elk Valley into the Kawanwa. Its monstrous size and dark reddish feathers, which glistened in the sunlight, cast fear in all who saw it. After World War II, people said they were chased by a huge bird while traveling on the highways of Mason, Jackson, and Wood counties near the Ohio River. Perhaps this first Mothman is the real one, after all. A gigantic bird with the head of a man. Sounds crazy, yes, but it's been there all along, it seems. And maybe, just maybe, it remains there still. Spring-heeled Jack. In the long history of mankind, few creatures can come close to matching the widespread terror that one fiendish inhumanoid visited upon the citizenry of Victorian England, especially its women, during the early 1800s. Spring-heel, or Spring-heeled Jack as he was called, and his name struck such a dread into the hearts of royalty and commoner alike as was not seen again there until the 1880s, when another Bane of London named Jack took over, that time Jack the Ripper. Unlike the Ripper, though, a mere mortal psychopath who only had eyes for women of ill repute, Spring-heeled Jack was a supernatural monster who plagued the city and all of its citizens with casual impunity. An evil-looking, darkly dressed, pointy-eared, unmanly brute who mocked with a sneer all attempts at capture, using his unnatural ability to leap impossible distances in a single bound. And whereas the Ripper was never seen and therefore indescribable, hundreds of frightened citizens claimed to have been victims of and witnesses to the antics of Spring-heeled Jack. And, thanks largely to the penny dreadfuls of the day, there was scarcely a person in all of Europe who didn't know his ghoulish face. In a 1961 article entitled The Mystery of Spring-heeled Jack, J. Viner wrote, quote, "The intruder was tall, thin, and powerful. He had a prominent nose and bony fingers of immense power which resembled claws. He was incredibly agile. He wore a long flowing cloak of the sort affected by opera-goers, soldiers, and strolling actors. On his head was a tall, metallic-seeming helmet. Beneath the cloak were close-fitting garments of some glittering material like oilskin or metallic mesh. There was a lamp strapped to his chest. Oddest of all, the creature's ears were cropped or pointed like those of an animal." End quote. In London, England, in the year 1837, people were much the same as people anywhere else. So much so, in fact, that few of them would pay much serious attention to reports of strange apparitions. And predictably, few did take notice when, in September that year, persons crossing a common in southwest London reported witnessing an alarming figure as it flew through the air in great leaps, as they described it. Then, however, the attacks began. There were 4 separate attacks in that year alone, 3 of the 4 victims being women. One victim, named Polly Adams, suffered the indignity of having the top of her dress ripped off, as well as being scratched on the belly with clawed fingers that felt cold and hard as iron. One evening that autumn, a businessman decided to take a shortcut to his residence, a route which led him through the local cemetery, where he allegedly encountered a tall, shadowy figure. The apparition vaulted over the railings and high into the air, landing with a thud right in front of the terrified witness, who, understandably, turned and fled. He later claimed that this menace had glowing eyes, a pointed nose, and pointed ears. The following night, the figure appeared to 3 girls in the same area, once again springing from the railings and landing before them. The terrified females fled the scene when the ghoul attempted to rip the coat from one of them. The slowest of the trio was apparently caught by the fiend, who pawed at her breasts and tore at her clothes. She collapsed and was later found unconscious by local police. What marked these incidents as being any different from the many other conventional assaults of the time was the assailant's ghoulish and terrifying appearance. This criminal was always described as being tall and thin, wearing a dark cloak and tight-fitting garments. According to witnesses, he also sported some type of helmet and usually wore a strange light strapped about his chest. More alarmingly, the phantom fiend also possessed the ability to spit blue fire from his mouth into the faces of his victims, blinding them. He had a pointed nose, pointed ears, glowing red eyes, and could leap astonishing distances through the air, moving so swiftly that it was impossible to either escape him or catch him, depending on the circumstance. Due to his unnatural leaping ability and his swiftness, the press quickly dubbed the entity Spring-heeled Jack, and the subject quickly became the talk of the town. In no time at all, Spring-heeled Jack was a household word, synonymous with other words, none of them pleasant. Jack gave the children the air of face to attach to the monster which they feared lurked beneath their beds and in their closets. Many an unruly child, it could be said, were quieted with the word, "Here comes Spring-heeled Jack. Here comes the boogeyman." A month after the attacks began, a servant girl named Mary Stevens was accosted by the frightening entity as she walked down Cutthroat Lane near Clapham Common. A tall figure adorned in black garments leapt from the darkness and grabbed hold of her, slobbering on her face as it attempted to kiss her lips and groped her breasts. She screamed, and the figure fled into the night. Her screams attracted the attention of some passers-by who were able to calm the girl. The following evening, and in the same area, Jack appeared again, leaping in front of and halting a horse-drawn carriage. On being confronted with the creature, the horses bolted in panic, causing the carriage to overturn, injuring the coachman. Jack escaped the scene by leaping effortlessly over a 9-foot wall. Soon after, another woman was attacked by a dark-caped figure at Clapham churchyard. Again, he escaped, but reportedly left behind 2 mysterious footprints impressed 3 inches deep in the mud that appeared to suggest that the leaper had been wearing some type of apparatus. Several more brutal attacks followed in the coming years, but Jack had never been accused of killing anyone. Then, in 1845, Jack appeared in a London slum. There, in full view of numerous witnesses, he brutally attacked a 13-year-old prostitute named Maria Davis as she was crossing a bridge. According to the eyewitnesses, the inhumanoid fiend leapt through the air and set upon the poor girl, grabbing her firmly by the shoulders and spitting fire into her face. Then he cruelly tossed the unfortunate child into the open sewer below and watched as she drowned to death. Spring Hill Jack had committed public murder in broad daylight. The entire country was soon up in arms, as might be expected, but, as always, they were completely powerless against this devilish threat. Jack simply could not be apprehended, and the populace, by now, had become so terrified of him that most dared not venture out of doors once night had fallen. 66 years after his first appearance, Jack's hellish glowing eyes were seen for the last time in Liverpool. He created a public panic there one night in September of 1904 when he was observed bounding up and down the streets, making leaps of 20 to 30 feet from the cobblestones to the rooftops and back again. When cornered by some very brave individuals, Spring Hill Jack simply vanished right before their eyes into the darkness, never to return. During the years between 1877 and his final appearance in 1904, Spring Hill Jack was not reported again in England, but, unlike many of his diabolically bizarre kinfolk who appear once or twice and are never seen again, Jack didn't exactly fade from sight and into legend when he left the home country. It may be argued that he merely embarked on a lengthy tour of the rest of the world, if eyewitness testimony is correct. Sightings of Spring Hill Jack and others like him have been happening right on down until recent times, right here in America. But that, my friend, is a story for another time. St. Helens, Michigan, 1968. 1968 was my first year for deer hunting. I bow hunted in the early season with my dad in Brighton that year. Gun season started on November 15th, so myself, my dad, Grandpa, and my uncle all loaded up and went camping/deer hunting. We tried hunting in the Huron National Forest at first, with no success. 2 weeks later, we pulled stakes and headed a little south to St. Helens. We drove around public land looking for a place for an afternoon or evening hunt. After finding a place that looked like it had potential, we pulled off the road, loaded up our guns, and headed out. The plan was to go and fan out and look for game trails, and hopefully a deer would come by. I was headed through pines that were planted in rows about 10 feet apart, and the trees were about 8 feet apart from each other. My dad had always told me, when you walk in the woods, take a couple steps, then stop and look around. A couple of steps at a time resembles the way wild game go through the woods, and you won't spook the deer by walking like a human. I decided that I would go through these pines until I found a clearing, then stop and wait for a deer to come by. About 100 yards in, I did my 3 steps and stopped to look. When I started again, I thought I heard steps when I walked this time. I looked all around and below the branches for deer legs. Didn't see anything, so I went again, and this time I could hear the steps matching my own steps. I thought that was weird. I looked again, and nothing. I went again, and this time it sounded like the steps were coming toward me. I looked really hard again, and nothing. I thought to myself that maybe it's a deer that's thinking I'm a deer by the way I'm walking. I was on high alert now, thinking I was going to harvest my first deer. Suddenly, I got a whiff of something awful smelling, really bad. I'd never smelled anything like it before. I got nervous and scared. I had the feeling I was being watched and felt sick to my stomach. Then the woods changed, and I don't know why. It was like time was standing still. No bird noises, nothing. I got really sweaty and felt a gloom come over me that I'd never felt before or since. I don't know what was going on, but I had the feeling that I wasn't going to make it out of the woods alive. I took 3 big steps starting in the direction of where the steps were coming from. I was shocked at what I saw. The tree branches that were right next to me were being spread about 5 feet apart over my head. I didn't see anything walking, but I could see the limbs being parted and hear the footsteps right next to me. I was perplexed. How can this be happening? I leaped to the next row of pines and crouched down, hoping that whatever it was didn't find me. The footsteps kept going after I stopped. A voice spoke in my head and told me twice not to look at his face. Now I'm breathing so heavy, I feel like I'm going to pass out. Where'd that come from? What just told me not to look at his face? I had to look around, but kept my face low. I looked under the branches to see a pair of white, hairy legs step into the row that I was in. I could see at least 4.5 feet of legs. As big as they were, and as safe as I felt looking, it wasn't even up to the thigh. That thing was huge. It stood there for what seemed like 10 or 15 minutes, then walked forward. It only took 2 steps to clear the space to the next row, about 10 feet, and it kept right on going. I didn't move until I couldn't hear it walking anymore. Then I went as quietly and as fast as possible back to the car, locked the doors, and waited for everyone else to come back. I never returned to the woods after that for 8 years when my brother finally talked me into going with him. I decided I wasn't going to ever say what happened in St. Helen. Fast forward, a new show on TV called Finding Bigfoot. I watched the first show and made a mental note to watch it the following week as well. The show starts, and my wife, who has known me 30 years, asked me why I wanted to watch a show like that. That's when I told her what happened to me in St. Helen. She believed me from the first by just the way I was telling the story. My voice changed when I got into the details, she said, and I had a genuine look of fear on my face as I told her, too. I started researching about Sasquatch on the internet and buying books and reading them. That incident was the only time in my life that I ever had a fear so bad that I thought I was going to die. It was a feeling I haven't felt since. I started telling what happened to my family members. Not sure if they believed me or were just being nice to not hurt my feelings. My uncle doesn't go into the woods with no less than 3 guns. I joined some Facebook Bigfoot groups. The first one, we were forbidden to talk about cloaking or be eliminated from the group. I felt really stressed that I could only talk about part of my story. I've learned a lot over the last few years. Yes, other people have seen them cloaked too. And that voice that spoke in my head to not look at his face was a Sasquatch warning me. I never said a word about it to anyone until the second season of Finding Bigfoot. Didn't think anyone would believe me. The cloaking, I was too afraid to say that. People would think I was nuts. It, or another one, mind spoke to me. Told me twice not to look at its face. I too thought that I was going to die. That's the feeling it gave me. I was 15 years old at the time. Never even heard of these things. It had white hair, and everything I've told you is the truth. William W. Powlack, 2016. The Beast of LBL. Paranormal investigator, the late Jan Thompson, claimed to have had many brushes with unknown phenomena. One of her most frightening encounters concerns a dogman which attacked one of her cousins one day during summer vacation at their home near the Land Between the Lakes in Livingston County, Kentucky. Here's what happened in her own words, quote, "It was one of those typical sultry July late afternoons back in 1978 in Grand Rivers, Kentucky, when this encounter with the inexplicable creature transpired. I'd come down to stay at my aunt's house for a few weeks of summer vacation and spend some time with my 2 cousins. Her home was surrounded by generously wooded and hilly acres, and sat at the end of a dead-end road. There were several trails throughout the woods that led to more than a few places, a long out-of-service railroad track that went on for miles, an old abandoned sawmill, a large section of rough rock bluffs, and a lonely stretch of shoreline on Barkley Lake. Most of the trails were made by my cousin Joe's dirt bike and were well defined. As it was with almost every day that I was visiting, Joe, 13 at the time, was out riding his bike through those woods. His younger sister, Rhonda, she was around 10 at that time, and myself were sitting outside on the porch swing waiting for their mother to come home from grocery shopping. I was 17 years old. The stillness of the afternoon was interrupted by the distinct sound of his dirt bike in the distance, screaming through its gears, echoing inside the trees. I knew he must have been on his way home because his dad had forbidden him or anyone else in the family to be out in the woods after dark. I could hear the bike's motor as it approached us at full throttle. I was expecting him to slow down, but he didn't. Still at top speed, he reached the trail opening at the top of the driveway and burst towards us, actually going airborne for a few feet. The front tire crashed down on the pavement, and he continued his descent, struggling to keep the bike upright. He hit the brakes hard to avoid going past the driveway and down an embankment, slid the bike sideways, and jumped off in a daring maneuver. He had a look on his face, like something terrible had happened. His eyes were wide with fright, and his body shook from the adrenaline. Sweat was rolling down his face, and he drew deep, rapid breaths through his mouth, which was drawn taut in a strange grimace. Tears were coming down his cheeks, mixing with the dusty trail dirt, and they remained, unblinking, as he turned to stare at the top of the hill and at the end of the driveway in fearful anticipation. The basset hounds that their parents raised began barking wildly, which turned to growls and then to whines. They were kept in a pen across from the driveway, and all of them seemed to panic at once, digging and gnawing at the fencing, desperate to escape. This happened in a matter of less than a minute, taking Rhonda and myself by complete and utter surprise. "It grabbed me! Look at my leg!" Joe screamed, making us jump with alarm at the sound of dread in his voice. His Levi's were scratched all the way through the flesh, leaving bloody marks on his skin. The claw marks were larger than what a grown man could have made. "It walked on 2 legs!" he yelled, scaring us again, as he was trying to tell his story in between huge gulps of air. "It was following me, through the woods, along the path, from the old sawmill. Hairy. It was so hairy. And it had a snout. And it walked on 2 legs. It ran on 2 legs." His voice was sputtering, and I could see his pulse throbbing under the skin of his temples. In that moment, the howling began. It came from the woods at the top of the driveway. We all stood deathly still. Even the hounds had suddenly grown silent and still. It sounded, at first, like a mournful wolf's howl, but more profoundly chilling and, as it came closer, more threatening. Joe began pushing us toward the front door, demanding us to go inside when it came out of the woods above. With the sun just going down, it turned the creature into a silhouette of hairy blackness. It stood maybe a foot taller than a good-sized man and was twice the breadth in the shoulders and chest, which was heaving quickly, like someone who had just finished a long-distance race. When it raised its head, as well as its arms, up into the air to continue its guttural vocalizations, I could make out the shape of a snout. Not as long as a canine, but not a nose either. The security light overhead popped on and suddenly illuminated the creature, making it raise one of its arms to shade its eyes, which appeared a bit oversized for its face and solid black in color from the glare. We tore the screen door, trying to get into the house all at once, and started barricading the main entrance. Then we heard another howl just outside, coming closer, and we all retreated into a back bedroom and barricaded that door as well. The basset hound they had inside as a pet had smelled around the front door, then tucked its tail and ran along with us. The other dogs outside were going crazy again, as we also heard items being thrown around on the porch, continuing all around the side of the home as well. There was also the unmistakable sound of a window being shattered, just before we heard my aunt's horn blare from her car as she drove down the road. We didn't budge to help with the groceries. Later that evening, my aunt relayed our frenzied tale to my uncle. He was skeptical, but when he went out and witnessed the broken window and the huge mess outside the house, he decided to go out the next morning into the woods with a rifle on his shoulder. He returned a few hours later with such a look on his face that left no doubt he was now a believer. He warned us all very sternly to stay out of the woods. He had found several large pits that had been dug and filled with animal bones and parts of rotting carcasses along the path that led to the old sawmill. He also saw where something had dug holes which looked like deep caves, big enough for a man to hide in the sides of the bluff along the hills that overlooked the mill. There was a rank smell in the area, which was unlike the stench of rotting animals. It literally turned his stomach, but he could not identify it. He related further that, years before, when the old Boy Scout camp used to be on the other side of Grand Rivers, that an unexplained two-legged creature with wolf-like features was seen along the water's edge, close to the campsites, and that he and his son had witnessed it themselves one evening on the Kentucky lakeside. When summer was over and school resumed, Joe would venture gradually back into those same woods on his dirt bike, with a pistol on his belt for protection. There were many times he felt it watching him and would actually turn and see it again, heavily jogging toward him with a warning howl. For safety's sake, Joe decided to make some new trails on the other side of the woods. At night, though, after all was quiet and asleep, sometimes the dogs outside would start acting erratic, trying to get out of their pen again. And more than a few times, when Joe had fallen asleep in the living room floor watching TV, that familiar feeling of something intently watching him would cause him to awaken. He would look over at the patio doors that were open to let the cool air in and see the creature leaning down and staring at him through the screen door. In the early 90s, Joe and my dad, who had come down to visit, would both travel on foot into those same woods and go all the way back to the old sawmill. They found old as well as freshly dug dirt pits with animal bones in them. The holes in the bluff were still there, and they both experienced the feeling of being watched and felt uneasiness that something just wasn't right. The area where the sawmill stood seemed to have no life stirring around it. No birds, no squirrels, crickets, bugs, etc. Even the small pond that lay separate from the lake shore stood still and lifeless. And all around it smelled like a combination of skunk and wet dog. When a large shadow moved from inside one of the holes in the bluff, the men retreated, walking backwards for a while before turning to make haste back home. Today, those trails have either grown over or they were bulldozed away at some places. Construction crews came in where the sawmill was and demolished acres of the land to make room for condominiums and new homes. My aunt's home still stands at the end of the road, but even further neighborhood advancements are taking place all around them. I'm sure the creature we saw all those years ago has left for more quiet surroundings and hunting grounds, but it must not have moved far, as there are still local sightings of it a few times a year." End quote. Miss Thompson also claims to have witnessed this creature, or others like it, on more than one occasion in the general area, and has extensive knowledge of local folklore and events concerning these wolf-like anomalies. One such event that she claims to be aware of personally is extremely disturbing and involves the gruesome killings of a vacationing family in the LB area back in the early 1980s. She says, quote, "I believe it was around the beginning of May," she told me, just before the tourist season would start on Memorial Day, when the following event occurred. I must make note here that this story was never published in the paper or on the news, nor did it have any media attention at all. All the witnesses to the facts were contacted shortly after the incident and strictly instructed not to repeat anything they saw, share any information, or disclose where the actual location was. A few particular individuals said in later interviews that some high-ranking government officials threatened to take away their jobs and pensions if they ever disclosed any aspect of this particular case. So, for nearly 2 decades, most of the people that were involved kept silent. 2 local police officers, I'll name them Adam and Bill to protect their identities, came in while I was on duty at the same service station. They usually came by during the night, got coffee and a snack, chatted a bit, and then left. But on this night, they had just come from a crime scene in LBL and had been there for over 8 hours. It was around 3 in the morning, and they both appeared particularly shaken, pale, and acting curiously bewildered. Adam sat on the curb next to some gas pumps expelling his stomach contents, while his partner, Bill, came in to get coffee for himself and water for Adam. Being a slow night, I went outside with Bill to see if I could offer some assistance. 15 minutes of hushed silence passed, except for the occasional dry heaving sounds from Adam. They both appeared in a disoriented stupor, and it was Adam who spoke first. "I can't believe it. It's not possible. I just can't believe it." The conversation that followed was in broken sentences at first, but ever so slowly, fragmented descriptions of their recent ordeal were revealed. Finally, it was Bill himself who divulged the whole frightening account. They had gotten a call to help with an investigation at one of the many rural campgrounds down in LBL. Several types of law enforcement were already there, state troopers, sheriffs, deputies, etc., when they arrived around sundown. Also present were several coroners, each from different counties. A young married couple that was camping in the area had discovered the scene and reported it to the authorities from a payphone in Grand Rivers. They had only given directions to the crime scene and their names, the officer said. They had flat out refused to return to the LBL area. A motorhome was discovered with one of its doors hanging by one hinge, along with bloody handprints along the metal outside walls. Ripped and bloody clothing and the remains of 3 bodies were also found on the property. The gouging wounds found in what remained of the bodies were made by thick, long claws, and the deep teeth and bite marks were made from some long incisors along with a large snout, according to one of the first examining coroners. The rake marks in the flesh were made up of 4 distinctive long strokes, with an additional smaller digit stroke, like that from a thumb, and its span was much wider than that of a man's handprint. The theories that a bear, wolf, mountain lion, or coyote could have done the damage were dismissed, as the injuries were clearly made by a much larger animal. Bears are not native to the area. Along with all the evidence collected, there was also found a clump of long gray and brown hairs in the hand of one of the victims. From the clothing that was examined inside the camper, the authorities presumed that the victims had been a family, consisting of a father, mother, a young boy, and a small girl. Yet there was only one body missing, that of the little girl. It was Adam that inadvertently discovered her up high, dangling from a tree, positioned on a limb. Parts of her body had been leisurely eaten. Some of the same long gray and brown hair was found sticking in the bark of the tree near her body. About a month after this incident, Adam and Bill stopped by during one of my midnight shifts. They seemed to have aged quite a bit, with streaks of gray in their hair and beards which had not been there before. Their faces showed signs of stress. They told me in confidence that they got word that the test results from the hair samples and saliva taken from the bite marks came back with an unknown origin of species, and that the closest animal that they could compare them to was that of a Canis lupus, a wolf. Goatmen and other horned devils. Many people are of the mistaken opinion that the Goatman phenomena is entirely contained within the state of Maryland. But, in truth, the idea originated in the ancient world with the Greek satyrs and the Greek god Pan, who took the form of a satyr, and the Roman fauns and sylvans. Despite the passage of many centuries, people are still seeing these creatures, in varying sizes and colors, all over the world. These entities were classically described as having a human torso, arms and head, and the lower body and legs of a goat. They were thickly covered with hair, had short horns, and hooked noses. They were also said to be very lustful and fond of strong wine, dancing, and playing the panpipes. Country people paid tribute to them by offering them the first fruits of their harvests, and lambs were also sacrificed in homage to them. And here we have a classic example of the continued activity of the pantheon of the old gods, now stripped of all divinity and delegated to the realms of the demonic. While not all horned inhumanoids fit neatly into the goatman category, it is interesting to note here that the Greeks also recognized other horned entities besides satyrs. The Kilikanzaros, for example, were said to be demonic creatures with shape-shifting abilities, black skin, horns, sharp fangs, and long talons. Their name literally means beautiful centaurs in Old English. In 83 BC, it was recorded that some of the Roman general Sulla's soldiers had captured a satyr as the army marched against Greece through the city of Illyrian in Apollonia, near today's Dirac, Albania. They had surprised the diminutive creature while it was sleeping, according to the account, and eventually trapped it in one of the area's steep canyons. With some difficulty, they captured it and brought it before their general. It had a man's upper body with short horns on its head, hairy arms, and the lower extremities of a cloven-hoofed goat. It was said that the creature whined and moaned pitifully, but could not speak and uttered only inarticulate sounds. Moreover, it carried with it a terribly offensive smell, and, in fact, its appearance was so loathsome to the eyes, ears, and nostrils that Sulla had the creature immediately sent back to the wilderness. More recently, another witness claimed that he had seen a similar creature in Benaguasil, Spain. He had been searching through an old abandoned house in his area in April of 1986, he said, looking for old nails and wood and such, when he heard a commotion coming from upstairs. Thinking that he had disturbed another intruder, the man stood quietly for a few seconds. An eerie, uncomfortable silence then held sway over the dark and foreboding structure, and, as the man turned to go, he was confronted by a creature wearing a long white cape which failed to cover its gnarled, goat-like feet. Even more frightening was the creature's red, glowing eyes, which bore into the witness's own and filled him with terror. Quite understandably, he then made for a quick retreat, leaving the demon alone to its haunt. Although they may, or may not, have originated across the Atlantic, the horny devils also seem to find the shores of America much to their liking, making nearly simultaneous appearances in both Kentucky and Virginia. The earliest report of an American appearance of the horned ones comes from Bracken County, Kentucky. There, in 1866, residents of one farm were reportedly terrorized for over a month by the appearance of a most frightening creature, a giant, hair-covered inhumanoid with glowing eyes and two short horns jutting from its forehead. It was further described as being grayish-brown in color, with a barrel chest and large, sharp-looking claws at the end of its paw-like hands. It also had cloven hooves for feet and a long, pointed tail. The entity hissed like a serpent at the frightened witnesses before vanishing in a column of flame. Another goatman-type beast was seen in Virginia in 1866 and dubbed the Horror of Independent Hill. The witness, a man named Silas Brown, came forward claiming that a terrible monster with large horns and long, sharp claws was feeding regularly on his livestock. He was terrified of the thing, he admitted, which was 3 times the size of a man. Brown claimed that it was grayish-blue in color, but when agitated, it turned completely white and gave off a sickening stench. In 1983, a group of Kansas miners claimed that they were attacked by a terrifying beast while working the night shift in Iola, Kansas. They described the creature as huge and hairy, with blazing red eyes and horns. Terrified by the thing's sudden appearance, the miners all fled their post. In 1964, a group of terrified campers were said to have been harassed throughout the course of an entire evening by the billowback beast, a gray-colored, man-like giant with long claws and horns on its head, said to appear in the Aliso Canyon area in Santa Paula, California. The beast was allegedly known to have attacked a group of hikers before it vanished into thin air right before their eyes. No reasonable explanation for the creature was ever offered by local authorities. Then, 3 people observed a horny devil while hunting in the woods of Point Isabel, Ohio in 1967. The witnesses, a father, his 15-year-old son, and his brother-in-law, were all startled to happen upon a creature which the boy, Perry Adams, later described as 10 feet tall, a light tan color, with long arms, pointed ears, and short horns on its head. Perry's father reportedly fired on the creature, which screamed loudly, then dissolved into an eerie white mist. Over 50 years later, just what the trio saw still remains a complete mystery. Fort Worth, Texas, was also played host to the Goatman, or others of his odd kin anyway. Back in the late 1960s, the Lake Worth Monster, as it became commonly known, first came to public notice when it stepped out of the woods in 1967 in front of a group of startled teens who were hanging out on the Moss Point area of the lake. Terrified, they gave the typical Goatman description of the beast they saw. A satyr-like ogre, half man, half goat, tall and hairy. Other sightings of Goatman and similar horned entities have occurred in numerous locations throughout the country. But Kentucky, where the American versions of the Horned Devils seem to have started, is where we will end. Goatman is well known within Kentucky, the bluegrass state, especially in Jefferson County, where, back in the late 1940s and 50s, the creature was rumored to live beneath a railroad trestle over Pope Lick Road in the Fisherville area of Louisville. It was dubbed the Pope Lick Monster by the locals and was said to have the power to hypnotize area youth, making them walk out onto the trestle late at night to their doom, either beneath the wheels of an oncoming train or from the 80-foot fall into Pope Lick Creek. The numerous deaths which have occurred there are a matter of public record. Several resident farmers complained of finding livestock ripped to shreds there decades ago, and there's even one account of the creature chasing a Boy Scout troop from the area, screaming at them and throwing stones. Oddly, the Pope Lick monster was commonly considered to have the upper torso of a man and a goat-like head, and some even consider that it may have been nothing more than a Bigfoot creature with mange, as unlikely an explanation as any, one might suppose. Whatever the Pope Lick monster is, the legend still has the power, it seems, even now, to lure victims to their deaths on the railroad trestle there on Pope Lick Road, with the last known victim, an Ohio woman, losing her life there in 2016. Disappearing Act. This event occurred one crisp autumn afternoon in 1991 in Reed, Kentucky. My best friend Dave and I had decided that we wanted to go fishing on the Green River out behind the old Booth farm. So we loaded up the gear and the girls and headed out to do just that. After arriving, rather than walking the women through the woods, we took the more circuitous route along the edge of the fields. We finally made our way through the stretch of thin forest that ran alongside the river and settled down with our fishing poles and bait on the riverbank. After about a half an hour with no bites, I became restless and moved my line a bit further upriver on the other side of Dave. We were still all within 20 feet of each other. Me, then Dave, then the two girls who were sitting next to each other. The fish seemed in no hurry to bite, so we started talking idly about the place. I gave everyone a brief rundown of the local history, and there was a lot of history there. We'd lived on the Booth's farm in 1971, but had fled one night after my mother saw a glowing red flying saucer come down from the sky and land out behind one of the old barns on the property. I also told them about the history of Bigfoot sightings there, and the 2 times that my brothers and myself, while artifact hunting in the adjacent field, had found abandoned tents in this very spot where we were all fishing. Another 30 minutes went by with no activity, and it began to seem like it wasn't going to be such a good day for fishing after all. Everyone was getting somewhat bored, and my prankster nature finally got the better of me. I decided that it would be funny if I were to throw dirt clods at the girls and pull it off without them seeing me. I looked down at the ground beside me, and there lay plenty of ammunition, sure enough. I made certain no one was looking at me, then picked up a nice-sized clump, a soft one that would crumble on impact, and hurled the missile in their direction, giving it plenty of arch to allow me enough time to get turned back around and be just fishing before it hit the ground. I made sure to aim away from them a little, so as not to hit anyone, and the dirt clod landed about 3 feet behind them. When they turned around and asked who threw it, I had no idea, of course, what they were even talking about. In fact, I was sure they must be mistaken, as we were out in the middle of nowhere, and there was nobody else for miles. I was perfectly innocent of throwing anything at anyone, and even, perhaps, a little indignant at being implicated in such tomfoolery while involved in such a serious endeavor as trying to catch catfish. Actors have received Oscars for performances half as convincing as mine was that day. I gave them a few minutes to get calmed down, then, after making sure they weren't looking, lobbed another one at them. It landed in the same spot and had much the same effect as the first one. Accusations, denial, protestations of innocence, followed by incredulity and bewilderment. After a few minutes, I decided to let them have one more, and this time let them catch me in the act, and thus ease any nervousness on their part, which my highly accurate throwing skills and masterful acting abilities might have caused. Once again, I repeated the toss and stayed turned in their direction, this time smiling. When the dirt clod hit behind them, they looked up and saw me grinning, and knew instantly that I was the guilty one all along. And then something strange happened. As I was sitting there with a smile on my face, taking my well-deserved cussing from the girls, another dirt clod, a slightly bigger one, came flying down from the river bank behind us and landed in the same spot in which my own had landed. Then, all at once, the smiles immediately departed from everyone's faces, including my own. From my peripheral vision, I had clearly observed the object's trajectory and glanced back, but saw nothing, as the river bank sloped up for around 12 feet behind and above us. 100 implications ran through my mind at once, and I acted immediately. No sooner had the object struck the ground than I was up and on my feet, scrambling up the river bank to see who threw that dirt clod. As soon as I jumped up from my sitting position, the footsteps began. There was a heavy carpet of dead, dry leaves on the forest floor above us that day, and everyone could hear the footsteps plainly, which sounded like they belonged to a very large, heavy person, walking noisily and away directly behind us. It only took 4 steps away from us as I was hurrying up the incline, then stopped. 1, 2, 3. On the 4th footstep, my eyes leveled off with the upper banks, and I could clearly see the area from which the sounds, as well as the thrown object, according to its trajectory, had come. I immediately trained my eyes on this area, expecting to see a man, one of my brothers maybe, or another hunter or fisherman / prankster such as myself, but there was simply no one there. The 5th footfall never came, so I knew he had to still be there. But where was he? The trees weren't very thick, and visibility was good for quite a distance through the woods. Dave came up right after me, and we walked over to the spot in question and examined it closely. If I allowed as much as 10 feet of stride, I reasoned, for each step, which was surely a rather preposterous overshot, then the guy had to still be within 40 feet of where I was now standing. But there was simply no one there. Dave and I examined the entire area very thoroughly, but could find no sign that anyone, or anything, had ever been there, other than ourselves. Not even so much as a crushed or overturned leaf, when our own trail through them on our approach was plainly visible to us. The girls, now completely agitated again, and for genuine reasons this time, insisted on leaving immediately. As we left, I glanced back, knowing that whatever had thrown that dirt clod and taken those 4 heavy steps was either still exactly where it stopped, but completely invisible, or it had vanished without a trace into thin air. Was it Bigfoot? Due to my previous experience, I think it was. Whatever threw the object so accurately had to have opposable thumbs, like a man, but I know of no man who can stand a mere 20 feet behind me, take 4 steps away from me, and completely disappear into thin air in broad daylight under any circumstances. Do you? Attack of the Reptilians. Sometime during the pre-dawn hours on a June night in 1998, 17-year-old Christopher Davis was driving down a deserted road near the Scape Ore Swamp in Bishopville, South Carolina, when one of his tires blew out. He pulled over to the side of the road and shut off the engine. As he exited the vehicle and walked to the rear to retrieve the spare tire, he heard a noise coming from the darkness near the woods a short distance away, and, turning, was terrified to see a scaly, nightmarish, lizard-like creature running bipedally towards him, with clearly aggressive intentions. Horrified, the teenager leapt back into the vehicle, slammed the door shut, and locked it, just as the thing reached for the door handle. Local papers ran the story, to the delight of local skeptics who, much to be expected, ridiculed the witness, hurling at him a veritable laundry list of unsavory accusations and remarks, the very least of which, perhaps, was lying. But Davis never wavered from his claims that what he saw was a true monster and not a bear or something. He was quoted as saying, "I looked back and saw something running across the field towards me. It was about 25 yards away, and I saw the red glowing eyes. I ran back into the car, and as I locked it, the thing grabbed the door handle. I could see him from the neck down, with 3 big fingers, long black nails, and green rough skin. It was strong and angry. I looked in my mirror and saw a blur of green running. I could see his toes, and then he jumped on the roof of my car. I thought I heard a grunt, and then I could see his fingers through the windshield, where they curled around the roof. Also in South Carolina, and only 1 month later, on July 24th, two couples on a late-night pleasure cruise were terrified to see a 7-foot-tall, dark figure with glowing eyes run across the road in front of the car, heading towards a nearby swamp. The four witnesses drove straight to the authorities and told their story. Investigating officers Lee County Deputy Wayne Atkinson and State Trooper Mike Hodge returned to the sighting location the next morning and, amazingly, even troubled themselves to investigate the swampy area into which the group said the creature was heading. Hoaxers, after all, almost never rush into a sheriff's office acting terrified and spouting outlandish lies. Even so, the two officials were amazed to find 40-gallon barrels of old trash thrown around like children's toys, broken tree branches 8 feet above the ground, and bizarre 3-toed tracks over 14 inches long in the mud. Wildlife officials later claimed the tracks were a hoax, but offered no explanation for any of the other aspects of the case. Perhaps they'd forgotten that, only 10 years earlier in Brownstown, South Carolina, two witnesses, Tom and Mary Way, also claimed to have experienced a similar attack by a scaly lizard man, and, shortly thereafter, two more witnesses, both local hunters, also came forward to tell of their encounters in broad daylight with a strange, scaly, human-like creature which chased them from the swamp after they startled it while drinking water from a spring. Another South Carolina report from the 1980s comes from the Lake Murray area. 3 people, Buddy Browning, his wife Shirley, and friend Cord Brazel, were fishing on the lake when they claimed they were attacked by a lizard man with gills. Amphibious inhumanoids attacking humans? Preposterous, you say? Ask Mrs. Darwin Johnson, the unfortunate victim in this next account, which took place only a short distance from the Evansville, Indiana Twin Bridges. On October 21st, 1955, Miss Johnson of Evansville and a friend were swimming in the Ohio River at a place called Dogtown, just across the river from Henderson, Kentucky, when one of these unseen aquatic mysteries reached up from the depths, grabbing her firmly by the leg, and proceeded to drag her down beneath the murky waves, presumably to her death. It was only by kicking and beating her arms frantically beneath the water that she was able to break free and reach the surface for air, only to be grabbed again and pulled back under once more. Again, she managed to kick free and reach the surface, frantically swimming for a nearby inner tube and screaming to her friends. Yet, once again, she was grabbed by the leg and pulled under. Miraculously, she escaped the clutches of her would-be killer for the third and final time with the help of her friend, one Mrs. Lamble, somehow managed to make it, screaming, crying, and in shock, to the shore in safety, where they found that her attacker had left green palm stains as well as various abrasions and bruises where it had repeatedly grabbed her by the knee. Understandably, the incident left Johnson hysterical, and her husband was called from work and then summoned a doctor. Sedatives had to be administered to calm the poor woman's nerves. When a local newspaper ran the story the following day, several witnesses came forward and revealed that, at about the same time of the reported encounter, they had observed a shiny oval object flying a few hundred feet above the river. It was later reported that an Air Force colonel had contacted the Johnsons and urged them not to speak further of the incident to anyone. In any event, Miss Johnson found that the palm stain wouldn't wash off and remained with her for several days. She later said of her experience, quote, "Whatever this thing was, it had a strong grip, and it was very furry. All I know is that I will never go swimming in the river again." End quote. And she didn't. Now, nearly 70 years later, no one has since been able to offer a satisfactory explanation as to the possible identification of the creature involved in this terrifying account, and the case remains as baffling and unsolved today as it was way back then. Invisible Bigfoot. Sometimes it's not what we see that scares us the most, but what we can't see. Got a letter recently. "Hi, Steve. I'm a big fan of your work, and when I read in your book that you have had experiences with a being that you're unable to see with the naked eye, I thought that I would share with you my own experiences with this subject. There's a place in southern Henderson County, Kentucky, just outside the town of Smith Mills, called Burbank Lake, which has a small lake on one side of Highway 136 and a larger lake on the hill on the other side. That lake is situated between two very old cemeteries from the 19th and early 20th centuries. One of these crumbling graveyards still holds the remains of the poor black folk, or the help, who lived, worked, and died there long ago, and the other was used as a final resting place of the landowners, whose headstones were much more elaborate than the simple stone markers on the other side of the lake. The surrounding land is heavily forested, the woods having long since reclaimed that forlorn hill as its own, completely enveloping Burbank Hill and stretching down to be lost in the river bottoms of the Ohio. Many tales are told concerning this place, tales of ghosts and strange lights flitting through the trees, strange and eerie noises coming from the woods, and other things. One fellow told me that, while walking down the road in front of Burbank's Lake one night back in the 1980s, after one of his tires blew out, he was glad to see a light coming down the road traveling in his direction. Hoping to get a lift into town, he paused and waited, only to find that, when the light approached him, it wasn't a vehicle at all, but a glowing old-style wooden coffin floating down the middle of the road. In fact, so many ghostly encounters are said to have taken place there that the location eventually became known as Spook Hill. But it was the large lake there that piqued the interest of my three brothers and myself. It is, or was back then, a fairly good size, deep, and rumored for as long as we could remember to contain monster bass. The male members of my family have always been avid fishermen. So one day, back in the summer of 1987, we all made up our minds to grab a couple of friends, sneak in, and finally go fish that lake. This was totally against our dad's better judgment. He told us that after he found out about our plan. He'd lived in a small old house down in the field below Burbank's Hill when he was younger, and had been personally warned by Mr. Burbank himself never to let dark catch him outside on the property. He never said why, only that he had taken the advice and didn't stay there long before moving on. Still, he heard all the stories about the place and took them seriously. Also, my older half-brother, Harold, proceeded to tell us a story about the time he and his brother-in-law, Doug, and went night fishing there in a john boat a few years prior. He claimed that every time the two tried to land the boat and come ashore to leave, the woods would simply erupt with the sounds of breaking branches and heavy footsteps, forcing them to shove back out into the lake. It sounded like a herd of elephants was tromping around in there, he told us. Every attempt to leave the lake was met by this resistance, which frightened them both so badly they were forced to spend the entire night out in the middle of the lake. Only when dawn finally broke were the two allowed to leave, which they did in all haste, never to return. This intrigued me to no end, but the lure of catching monster bass was too enticing for us to resist, and so, undeterred, my brothers and I set about putting our plans into motion, completely disregarding the preponderance of good advice that we were just given, as young men often do. We arrived at the lake in the early afternoon and quickly headed through the trees down to the water's edge. One of our friends had been able to bring a one-man bass boat with a small trolling motor. It could hold 2 people, but just barely. As there were 6 of us, 4 brothers and 2 friends, this meant that 4 of us would be confined to fishing from the banks. We found the place to be absolutely teeming with water moccasins, and not one of us had brought a weapon of any type, not even a walking stick, only fishing gear. Since we all wanted to fish on the far side of the lake, nearly everyone opted to be ferried across the lake one by one, rather than walk through the tall grass and risk possible snake bite. Except for me and my younger brother, Victor. We took off on foot, making casts through the brush as we went, whenever possible, with our plastic lures. It took forever for the little motor to chug everyone across the lake. The day was made memorable from the offset as, about 2/3 of the way across the lake, I got my lure hung up in a tree limb, and, in trying to get it free without breaking the line, ended up with the lure getting stuck in my face. It took a good deal of time and wire cutters from the tackle box to free me from my unfortunate condition, let me tell you, but I did manage to save that lure. By the time we'd all made it to the other side, it was already afternoon, and the sun was already making a rapid descent below the trees behind us. We fished a while longer without much luck. I remember catching one largemouth that weighed a couple of pounds, and before we knew it, darkness was fast approaching. I quickly realized that we weren't set up for any nighttime fishing. We had no flashlights or lanterns of any kind. but for some reason, we had thought to bring along about a half a gallon of kerosene in a plastic milk jug. My older brother, who had been hogging the bass boat with a family friend all afternoon, finally puttered into shore and began the task of taking everyone back across the lake one at a time. This took about 30 to 40 minutes round trip, with 5 trips to be made in total. Not one of us was willing to walk back around the lake and to the road after dark. Vic and I had seen 7 or 8 water moccasins on our trip around the lake already, and that was in broad daylight. As it turned out, complete darkness fell with just me and Victor remaining on the far side of the lake. We had that half gallon of kerosene, and had earlier gathered what wood we could find, which was precious little, and mostly wet since it had rained hard there a couple of days previously, and we used it to build a small campfire. We were sitting there bemoaning how ill-conceived this trip was, when all of the night's sounds seemed to stop at once, and an unearthly silence settled over us. The frogs and crickets, even the insects, seemed utterly silent and still. Then suddenly, that silence was broken by the deafening sounds of breaking branches, falling trees, and thunderous footsteps erupting from the woods in front of us. It was a terrifyingly loud commotion, and we both jumped to our feet in fear. I have never before or since been so frightened by any type of sound. It was, looking back, totally unlike either of us to react in such a manner. Perhaps it was because at that first limb fracture, we both knew immediately what was out there in the darkness of those haunted woods. We both knew that there was only one extremely large animal in Kentucky that would dare approach men and fire at night. One animal that arrived with the sound of uprooting trees and breaking limbs. Bigfoot. Worse, the sounds soon began to come from behind us and to our right as well, and they were getting closer. There were no vocalizations of any kind. We heard no grunts, no growls, not even the sound of heavy breathing, just the ground-shaking footfalls and the terrific explosions of breaking tree limbs all around us, even though there now sounded like at least 4 impossibly heavy creatures attempting to surround us. We thought we were both going to die that night, without a doubt, and I still count myself lucky to have made it out of there alive. We could see nothing beyond the light of our meager campfire, as it was completely dark now, with no moon and heavy cloud cover. The sounds were staying just outside the circle of firelight, and, as the fire faded and the sounds got quite close, I threw some kerosene onto the fire, determined to at least see what was about to eat us both. The fuel ignited, and the fire flared up, briefly illuminating an area of about 30 to 40 feet or more in all directions. We saw nothing. The light only lasted for a few seconds, then it subsided, plunging our surroundings back into utter darkness. When this happened, the sounds would start to approach us again. Over and over this happened. Every time I let the sounds come closer and closer to us, a little closer each time, then threw some more fuel onto the shrinking fire, washing the woods in sudden firelight. Each time that I did this, all the sounds would immediately stop for a couple seconds, then resume as soon as the light faded. We never did see a thing, not even a single eye shine, and the kerosene didn't last too long. When the sounds once again got very close to us, this last time, at a distance of what sounded to be no more than 10 feet or less away, I threw the last of the fuel onto the fire. There was nothing there. Now, we'd been yelling and making a good-sized noise of our own to no avail. It seemed that only the light was holding our would-be attackers at bay. But our small fire was fading fast. Soon, it was reduced to a tiny flame at one end of a small wet branch. And the noises were closing in once again. The smaller the light became, the closer the ungodly racket approached. I grabbed the burning twig and held it up in front of me as we walked backwards down toward the water to our left, the only direction that was currently an option, and told my little brother, "Get ready to swim for your life." "I'm ready," he said. "I'm ready. I'm ready." The noises followed us down to the lake, amazingly, even where the area had very few or no trees. It now sounded like invisible branches were being broken and tossed around by invisible beings. Lucky for us, just as we were about to get wet, we heard the sound of our brother on the boat shouting his approach. We yelled back for him to hurry. When he reached us, we were in a state of extreme agitation, to say the least. He wanted to know who was next. "We're both next," I exclaimed. "No way, Bubba," he said. "This boat barely holds 2 people. 3 will sink it for sure." "Then all 3 of us will be swimming together," I said. "To put it simply, we found out that night that a one-man boat can actually carry 3 people in an emergency. None of us ever returned to Burbank's Lake after that."